There you go.
Okay, I think we're good now. So welcome everybody, Senate Education, May 12th, continuing our remote hearings during the COVID-19 emergency. And we have a single topic today, and I just want to set the stage for that. So for people listening at home, any of you, we've been operating on the assumption that everything, all of our business, 100%, needed to be connected to the COVID emergency. And so for the last several months, that's the way we've been operating. The President Pro Tem, Senator Ashe, and the Rules Committee have just very recently, in the last couple of days, allowed us to begin a slow pivot to pieces of legislation that are not necessarily emergency related, but that were high priority earlier in the session and that we had advanced to a certain level in the process. So for our committee, that's two bills. We had changes to the statewide healthcare bargaining statute. I believe that's 226 or maybe 224. 224 and 226 are the bill numbers. One is one and one is the other. But the other one besides that is the restructuring of the State Board of Education. Those, the committee will remember, were both long, arduous negotiations between diametrically opposed parties. And so they remain our committee's priorities. And at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the Rules Committee theoretically will allow us permission to move forward with those. So that's a big shift in what the committee has been doing. Now, the parallel shift is that the House was asked by the Speaker to address their priorities, and they came forward with three. So first was Act 173 delay, which we have already sent over to them. So that's a no-brainer. That's already done. The second is extending the timeline on the lead bill, which you'll remember was basically predicated on there being school in session during testing. And given that school is now out of testing, David Englander and the Department of Health and AOE were asking for an extension, a very logical extension, because they literally can't complete the testing according to the bill's parameters. So that again is a no-brainer, it seems to me. It's basically just changing the date by which they would be allowed to complete that work, which is now, I think, about half or 2/3 done. Their third and last priority is not a no-brainer, it is a brainer. And we'll have to think it out. It's a bill having to do with lifting the moratorium on aid for school construction. Now, we've talked about that in our committee here and there, but we've never had a prolonged discussion about it. Their bill started out as about a 12-page bill. It was H209, and it's now been refined down to 3 pages. It does have $1.5 million price tag, and it puts the agency to a good amount of work with that money. So the two questions I have going in about it are the price tag and the workload for the agency. There is a larger philosophical question about whether the state should get back in the business of aiding school construction, capital outlay, that kind of thing. So the last thing I'll say is that before we move forward with the two bills that are our priority, assuming the Rules Committee gives us the green light, I wanted to try to beforehand have, if possible, an understanding with the chair of House Ed, Representative Webb, about what they might be willing to work with, because it's not going to make sense for us to advance a bill that's a non-starter for them. So what I've asked Senator Ashe is, once we have permission, can we keep them in park until those agreements or semi-understandings are in place and then move forward? So I'm in contact with Representative Webb now, and we're beginning that collaboration. But in advance of that, I thought it was good for us to do the spade work on their bill, which the school construction bill, which is now in House Ways and Means. So toward that end, I've asked Becky Wasserman, who drafted the bill, to do two things: walk us through the bill, but also, as I understand it, Becky has a slideshow that she's developed about the history of school construction funding and the role the state has played. So Becky, there you are. I've asked Jeannie to put that slideshow up on our website. So
Okay.
if I could ask all the members of the committee to go to our website and find it under documents for today. And then I'll turn it over to Becky to introduce us to the topic, the history, and then the language she drafted for the House.
Senator Baruth, just
Yes.
to minimize the possibility for confusion, on the web page, it's not listed as the bill number because we're not in possession of it. It's
Yep.
just a title. Okay.
Okay. And the slideshow is titled Overview of State Aid for School Construction Projects. So take it away, Becky.
Okay. So Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. Would you like me to share that on my screen?
You know, Jeannie and I talked about that. I prefer it this way because I can toggle back and forth between you and the document. Whereas if you take over the screen, we're all limited to just the slideshow.
Okay. So I will, so everyone hopefully has it up in front of you. As you stated, it's the overview of state aid for school construction projects. And I had prepared this earlier in the session with Catherine Benham at JFO to present to the institutions committees. And I'll just go over her parts that were at the end, but the funding of school construction had come out of the capital bill. So this is definitely an issue that they like to review a lot in that committee. Just for some background, there for a number of years there is a program in statute that allows for the state to provide aid to schools who are doing constructing or purchasing school buildings. And that program was funded through the capital bill, but there has been a moratorium on that funding since 2007. And a number of things have changed since this program has been operational, but the statutory language has not changed. So if you look up the statute, it's in 16 VSA chapter 123. You'll see what I'm going to show you now is still in place. However, it's not actually functional right now. So the way it used to work was that a school would have to submit a preliminary application to the Secretary of Education that they would like to construct or purchase a new school or make extensive additions or alterations to that existing school. And they would submit approval for the construction aid. And I think it's worth noting here that the award that was provided to schools was not the total project cost, but it was the award was limited to a percentage of the project cost, as well as to only project costs that were considered eligible. And that is set out in statute. And there's also a Department of Education school planning construction guide from that time period that gives examples of what is eligible and what is not. So for example, a swimming pool would not be an eligible cost under this program. So the next step in the process, if a school received approval for their application, and the district voted to fund the total cost of the project, then the state board would put that project on a priority list, and priorities were then given were assigned a need-based points based on a system that is set forth in statute. So first priority was given to emergency projects that were over $100,000, and those were to address health and safety issues. Second priority was to address deterioration of a building or equipment over $10,000. And then all of the remaining priorities were in the third category.
Mhm.
So then in January of each year, the state board would submit a funding request to the House and Senate institutions committees, and the committees would recommend a total amount of a school construction appropriation that would be included in the capital bill. A school was not allowed to begin construction on their project until they received final approval from the board. And there was an exception for advance approval for good cause, but before any money was sort of given to that school, they had to have received final approval. And as I mentioned, the award amounts were not the total cost of a project. It was based on a percentage of the approved costs. So for most projects, that is 30% of the approved cost. For renewable energy projects, it's 75% of the approved cost of those elements of the project specifically related to the renewable fuel source being used. And then up until 2013, 50% of the approved cost for projects related to consolidation.
Mhm.
For career technical centers, there was also an award amount of up to 50% of the approved cost of the project.
And that was just across the board, just because it was a technical center?
Yeah, I don't believe there's any other limitations on that.
Okay. Before you go any further, Becky, could I ask, when you say that this is in statute now, but it's not operative, what rendered it inoperative? What's the mechanism by which the moratorium came to exist?
So I'll get to that a little further, but essentially it's
Okay.
just a moratorium through session law that has been in the Capitol bill, and it's gone through a number of iterations over the years, but it first was put in place in 2007, and it's still in place through session law.
So, well, you'll come to it later. Does that mean that every year in the Capitol bill, we've been reapproving it?
It has not been reapproved every year, but the language associated with it says that it won't be sort of operational again until the state comes up with a new plan of how to deal with funding for school construction. So I believe the last time it was in the Capitol bill was when the remaining debt was paid off in 2016. And then it was reiterated again there that sort of now that the debt is paid off, it doesn't mean the program is going to be going forward again. That the state still has to come up with a plan to how to deal with this. And part of that issue too, I think, is that the Agency of Education, I don't think, has sort of the administrative capacity to do this program. I don't know that they have anyone left there who is sort of familiar with how it worked, or they have the sort of staffing to be able to to start up the program again tomorrow if the state were to decide to fund it.
Okay, thank you. And please keep going.
So page 6 of the slides. So one of the provisions, and this is something that I wanted to raise in a different context, is the repayment obligation in Title 16 with respect to the school construction aid program. So there's a provision that says that if a school building is sold and the school district had received aid for that building, then the school district is required to refund to the state a percentage of the sale price of that building that's equal to the percentage of aid that they received. So that is not the percentage of the total sale price, of the total amount of aid they received. It's a percentage of the sale price. So if they were under that category of 30% aid, then they would have to do 30% of the sale price, not the total cost of what they had received. But then there's no more than the refunded amount shall not be more than the amount of aid that they received.
And that
So-
sunsets?
Yeah, so when Act 46 came out, this provision was sort of put on hold for schools that were going to be consolidating. And then in 2016, there was a repeal of this section for all schools for a 4-year period. So that is set to go back into effect on July 1st of this year. In the House Institutions latest version of the Capitol bill, they are proposing to extend that sunset for an additional year to July 1st, 2021.
And maybe this is for a later moment in your presentation. What's their thinking about an additional year as opposed to longer? What's their thinking about needing another year? I would say another year only.
I don't know that they discussed a different time period. I think part of it was just with everything happening right now, that they just were hoping next year they'd have more time to evaluate,
Mhm.
how long to actually extend it for.
Okay, so we'll keep that in mind as a related but separate issue.
Okay. So here on page 7 is sort of where you start seeing all the moratoriums that were put into place. So in 2007, the state decided to not authorize any more aid for school construction except for emergency aid and certain consolidation projects. And there was language in that moratorium that said it was the intent of the General Assembly to use that time to develop a plan for state aid for school construction, and they required recommendations from the Secretary of Education and Commissioner of Finance and Management. And then in 2008, the suspension was extended, and there were some additional terms that were put into the language. So a school district that is paying for the cost of a project could request the Agency of Education to review that project under the preliminary approval application process. And that could be used solely for calculating whether the district had exceeded the spending threshold. And that is still something that is in place today. I don't think, perhaps Mark can speak to this. I think maybe there's only one district that has done this, but recently, but I think a district could still apply under that preliminary approval process that I started with to prevent, if they're doing a school construction project, to prevent that amount from being part of their excess spending threshold.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So in 2009, the General Assembly again extended the suspension for a 3rd time and also clarified that the preliminary approval process could also be used to enable a district to proceed with projects using other funds besides state aid. 2011, there was another extension, and the Agency of Education was required to provide a report on the cost of lifting the suspension. And there was a direction of what they had to consider, including demand for new projects, how other states fund school construction, new funding formulas, and a recommendation about when to lift the moratorium. Then as you'll see, there was more sort of reaffirming the declaration to maintain the suspension in 2013. And then the state also said at that time that they were going to honor their obligation to repay the amounts that were sort of backlogged, that they would be done repaying in 2016. And again, in 2016, in the capital bill, the state completed payment on all the sort of back amounts for awards for past school construction projects. So as of right now, the state does not owe any money for school construction projects that they had awarded aid in the past. On slide 10, this is just some idea of the amount of money that this was costing the state. So prior to 2007, the General Assembly had been spending about 20% of the total capital funds that were available. And that was about 10 million per year on school construction projects. And there was also some one-time general fund amounts that were used to help pay down those state obligations. In FY 2008, after the moratorium was put in place and there was a realization that there was this large amount that was owed, the Joint Fiscal Office revised how much that amount was to 74 million. Since 2008, the state was putting in the capital bill approximately $7 to $10 million each year to pay down that program. And in FY 2016, there was $4 million that was in the capital bill, and that's where it was all repaid. And then it's worth noting that in the capital bill, there's still typically about $50,000 that's appropriated outside of this program for emergency projects. In 2018, in the capital bill, the General Assembly authorized the Secretary of Education to accept applications for planning grants for capital construction. That would result in the consolidation of student populations and the closure of at least one building. Nothing really came of that application process. No funds were appropriated in FY 2019 to support those grants.
Was that the institution's budget or bill?
Yeah, that was in the capital bill, but
Okay.
so it was just a application process in 2018, but there was no money appropriated for it, and then they didn't come back in 2019 to ask for any funds for that program.
Okay.
And then this is very tiny, so I don't know if you can see, but this is just the history, some history of the amount of aid and what schools received aid over the years. And so we can sort of scroll through that. And then there are a couple of reports that JFO and Ledge Council had done over the years. In 2001, there was a report that looked at the annual state obligation for school construction and found that the expenditures exceeded the amount of capital funding that would be projected for use. And it just sort of looked at sort of the long-term needs of school construction in the state. And again, in 2008, there was a report on certain options for changing school construction aid. And there are links in the slideshow to those reports if you're interested in reading what the outcome of those were. And then finally, in 2012, there was a report by the Department of Education with certain recommendations, and that report is linked as well. So they recommended that the moratorium remain at least through FY 15, that the state look at some separate funding mechanism, and incentives to consolidate school facilities should remain in place, and that the state involvement in project approval and quality control should be restored. And just on that point, I would note that that last point, number 4, that schools still are and can do school construction projects. They are just doing it through sort of local local bonding right now.
Mhm.
And Mark can explain this much better than I can, but that is still part of the education spending that comes out of the ed fund. So schools are receiving sort of aid in a different way through the education fund rather than through bonded dollars of the state through the capital bill. So that is a consideration. On that last point on number 4, the state program required certain quality control with respect to school construction projects in order to be eligible to receive aid. Now that it's sort of shifted to the local level and projects, that there's no like state oversight on how the construction projects are done. So I think that's just another issue of consideration going forward of sort of how to standardize that process.
Yeah, I think it's, if you look at the South Burlington bond, hundreds of millions of dollars, there was a general outcry that that district could go forward with such a bond and obligate the ed fund. But we've set up the system such that what else are people going to do? We're out of the business of funding them. If they are going to replace their school, they have to do it that way. So with the way we structure the ed fund, we are in essence giving them the ability to obligate other taxpayers with no oversight from the state. So when people talk about ending the moratorium, I think they hear we're going to spend a lot more money, but what they should be hearing in part is we're going to gain more control over the money that we're already spending. Or at least that's one way to look at it. What do you think, Becky? Turn to Mark now for.
Yeah, I guess I'll leave that to Mark if he might have some things to add to what I just said before we move to 209 to give more of a context to 209.
Mark, feel free to jump in with whatever you think is relevant.
Good afternoon. I don't have a lot to add to what Becky presented. So, focusing mainly on this bill, the idea was that we probably have huge construction needs out there in the state, and there's no aid currently coming out of the capital bill to do this. The concern was that without money from the capital bill, without more thought, we would continue to fund it the way we fund it now, which is, as Becky pointed out, just becomes part of your education spending and affects your tax rate and all other districts in the state as well. So I think the impetus behind here was, first of all, to try to get a handle on where we are right now, because we know anecdotally that there's significant need out there, even for health and safety reasons, that is not being met. But we don't have a good handle at the state level on how much need is out there and how much money we actually need. So the $1.5 million appropriation in here was the amount we estimated we need for the Agency of Education to go out and hire a consulting firm to come in and actually go out and physically inspect every school building in the state and come up with an estimate of their capital needs so that we could do a more comprehensive look at what the need is statewide and figure out how to fund it from there. So I think this part, the bill that's in front of you right now, apart from the history that Becky's given you, is looking forward, recognizing that we have a need, acknowledging that we don't know how big that need is, and we don't have a really good way to fund it yet. So that was what this legislation was intended to address.
Okay, and if I could ask, I always am a little amazed that estimates wind up with very round numbers. To what extent is $1.5 million derived from actual data, or was it like more than $1 million, less than $2 million?
Yeah, somewhere in between.
Okay.
It was based on 9 cents per square foot,
Okay.
and an estimate of the square footage we have in the state. So it wasn't pulled out of thin air, but
Okay.
it's a rough number.
All right. Good enough. Just a heads up for the committee. I did get an email from Representative Webb And so she's thinking of this bill now, post-COVID, as something that might be running on two tracks. We might be able to figure out spending needs that track with federal dollars, things that are emergency related along the lines of construction. And then obviously like just the deferred maintenance and construction that we've been doing for decade after decade. Okay, Becky, would you like to take us through the actual language of what the House passed to Ways and Means?
Sure.
That's all. That's also on the website under documents.
Yeah, so that should be version 1.4 of the amendment to H209.
Okay, go ahead.
So section 1, so this is a strike all amendment of the underlying bill. So section 1 is looking at school facility standards. And the idea was that in order to sort of start thinking through how funding would be done, that sort of standards need to be put in place for doing construction projects. So subsection A says that before January 15th of next year, the Secretary of Education would work in consultation with the Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association, the Chair of the State Board of Ed, and the Commissioner of BGS to update the school construction facility standards. And that update would also reflect modern educational requirements and opportunities. So this is acknowledging that a school building today might have different standards than how the program operated, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And then subsection B says that the State Board of Ed shall update and adopt a capital outlay financing formula by January 15th of 2021. So in the school construction aid program statute, it directs the State Board of Education to adopt a rule to establish this capital outlay financing formula, which is looking at the sort of maximum and minimum square footage that's needed for by school size and per student for programs. And that is a rule that's actually in place right now. It's State Board Rule 6124.1, but it obviously has not been updated in a number of years. So this is asking the State Board of Ed to update that rule.
So these would be restrictions on local districts in terms of the size that they could bond to pay for.
If they were applying. So the way it worked was under the program, in order to receive aid, a classroom had to be a certain square footage or size based on the number of students and the size of the school. So there was a formula that set out how much money they would receive based on sort of what the construction plan was. And this is asking the school board the state board to update that rule based on sort of more just based on what the requirements would be today. Like, for example, if a computer lab was going to be built, like I don't know if that was considered 15 years ago about what the square footage of that room would have to look like.
I'm just focusing on that last line there that says the formula shall also establish an allowable cost per square foot. Is that in order to receive the funds, you can't spend more than this per square foot, or is that regardless of whether you receive funds?
So I think that I need to double check on the rule, but I think the aid is only paying for a portion of the project. So that's sort of the maximum amount that you would receive per square footage for your project, but it doesn't mean that the school couldn't, I guess, do more than that. It would be what the amount of the award would be for that like the upper limit of what the award would be based on that cost per square foot of construction.
Because I don't know why, but in reading it, it seems to me to be much broader than that. It seems to establish an allowable cost per square foot for the entire project. Is that not so?
I can pull up the rule here quickly.
Becky, if I could jump in, doesn't the agency have to approve the project period before they're eligible for any aid?
Yes, they have to receive final approval before they get aid.
And isn't this part of the approval process to see if their proposal meets the requirements that have been laid out?
Okay, so when we say aid, do we mean, because there are two types of aid that the state is basically providing.
The old kind, the grant.
This is under
Okay.
the old formula.
Okay, good enough. So let's keep going.
Okay, so section 2 is asking the Secretary of Education by February 15th of next year to work in coordination with BGS to issue an RFP for a school facilities conditions analysis to inform AOE of the conditions of the needs and the costs for school facilities around the state. And that analysis would include a review of both school facilities conditions and space needs. This is what Mark was referencing with respect to the 1.5 million appropriation. So in subsection B, the Secretary of Education would contract with this third party and would have that analysis be completed on or before June 15th, 2023. And there's a total appropriation in subsection C of 1.5 million from the Ed Fund to pay for this analysis. And then in subsection D, there is a definition of school. And the idea here was that in order to do a conditions analysis of all the schools, there needed to be sort of parameters of what would be included. And so I suppose for ease, the definition of school here is the same definition that is used in the school construction aid chapter in 16 BSA 3447.
So update facility standards, hire a third party to do a statewide assessment, and then a report on what's involved with lifting the moratorium. Okay. Questions? Oh, go ahead, Becky.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Questions from the committee about this bill, which, as I said, is not final. It's in Ways and Means. I believe it would go to appropriations after that. Is that probably? So, you know,
there's an appropriation in here, so it would need to go through.
So it has a good road to travel, and past history would suggest it'll be changed probably fairly substantially before we would ever see it. But questions on this version of it for Becky or for Mark? Yeah, Andrew, and then Debbie.
Yeah, if we are going to take more testimony, I'd like to hear from the superintendent's school energy management program, because they used to go around to all the schools. They had a circuit rider. Even though he was focused on energy, he really did a lot of other work and had, you know, been in all the schools around the whole state. And I think his name is Norm Etkin. He could maybe help. And I think there's been some of this work has been done before. Instead of going out and doing it again without a funding source, we might want to just say, well, here's what it was before and update it. But I guess my specific question is on the school construction facility standards, were those rules that were written by AOE, or they were just standards that they kind of had unofficially, not rules?
They were not rules. There is a Department of Education school construction planning guide that I think informed how a school had to go through this process. And so I think it is sort of that idea of updating the school facility standards is based off of that planning guide. And I can send a copy of that
still-
to the committee.
Yeah, if you could send
Okay.
it, that would be good.
Andy, if you would give the name of that person to Jeannie, Norm, whatever. his
Norm
last name-
Metkin, he retired. They stopped the program, but he's still around. And we could talk to Jeff Francis. He worked with Jeff Francis.
Yep. I was a little surprised that the superintendents were included and not other entities
Yeah.
that are typically brought in, but I suppose it makes sense. Debbie?
Yeah, thanks. So I just want to make sure I got the timeline right. So the secretary is gonna put out an RFP for this analysis by next February. And then they have over 2 years to do the analysis, right? And the $1.5 million is just paying for the analysis. It's not actually going out to any of the schools for anything. So in the meantime, the schools could continue to do construction the way they're doing it now by putting it in their in the state education tax. Did I understand that
That's
correctly?
right. So there's about 1.5 years baked into this timeline to do this analysis. The 1.5 million does not go to the schools. It just goes to the third party who's conducting the analysis. And I think that raises a good point that in this 1.5 year interim, a school district could certainly bond to do their own project to try to, I suppose, get it in before the process is changed.
It's,
Yeah,
I think it's, oh, go ahead, Jim, or Mark.
I was just going to say, on the other hand, I mean, it's 1.5 years, but districts are aware that the outcome of this is likely going to be some kind of a reinstitution of aid. So if they went ahead in this 1.5 years on their own, they'd be on their own dime, basically, and potentially leaving money sitting on the table that might be available after this study's done.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm always a little wide-eyed about when I look at what the House does, they tend to spend large amounts of money on consultants. And so in this case, it's, to Debbie's point, it's $1.5 million that's going to create essentially a catalog of needs. If you put that $1.5 million out for grant and said, come forward with your needs, you would develop a catalog of needs and you'd get $1.5 million out. So, and you also wouldn't wait 5 years to break ground on any of that.
Very true.
So, Mark, to that?
Well, I was just going to say, I don't have the expertise to do this. These are engineers that would actually go out and do an evaluation from the basement up to the roof, and provide, dollar amounts to bring it up to standards or to do whatever. So I'm not sure that schools currently have the expertise to do this. The other problem is we have 151 different school districts all making decisions on their own.
Yep.
And they're coming forward as they need it. The money. One of the concerns of Ways and Means is that if we keep going forward with sort of the ad hoc way we do things right now, the limited money that we have available in the education fund to support these costs may not be going to the places that are most needed. For example, up in the Northeast Kingdom, there are some schools that have health and safety violations that are frankly shocking, and they are unable to pass bonds to make any improvements in their schools under the current system. And other school districts are able to quite easily pass large bonds. Burlington's passed one recently, and I'm going ahead with it. So that's part of the issue.
Scaling that back, by the way, because it went over budget. But Becky, and then over to Ruth.
Sure. I was just going to add to that I think part of the idea with Section 1 of creating the sort of standard standards for schools is that those would be used by the engineers doing the assessments around the state, so that all schools would be looked at in the same way, rather than a school sort of independently doing an assessment of their needs. This way, everyone is sort of put on the same level in terms of how they're looking at what needs are.
Yep, and I get that. So, but if we did section 1 and we reinstituted an updated list of priorities by which requests were categorized, and those had to come forward with engineering that met the facility standards, yeah, I remain a little bit to be convinced about the utility of another statewide assessment. Ruth?
Yeah, thank you. To that point, and also what Senator Perchlik said, I think some districts actually have done this type of engineering work. And so I wouldn't want to reinvent the wheel. I know that my school district where my kids go, ACSD, has actually hired a consultant engineer and done this work as it's laid out in this bill. And so it would make no sense to have to do it again and spend that money again. So I guess it would be great to know what's already been done, and if we could catalog that and then just fill in the holes. And then a quick question for Becky, and then one more thing is, Becky, this definition of schools, is that public schools only? This isn't for private schools, is it?
There are, let me just bring it up because.
Does it include, it must include the academies or something somehow? I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. It's incorporated school districts, joint contract schools, town school districts, union school districts, regional career technical center school districts. And then there's this funny definition of independent schools. That's an independent school meeting certain educational quality standards that serve as the public high school for one or more towns or cities, or combination thereof, and that both receive their principal support from public funds.
That's probably the traditional academies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it goes on a little further, but I think that in looking into this question before, there were only like 2 or 3 independent schools that met that definition.
Yeah.
Jim, is that the traditional academies?
It's a subset, actually. It's because it's being education quality standards. It's basically, I think, only Thetford.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
If they do still, they used to be only Thetford, maybe not anything now. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right.
So,
yeah,
just
go ahead, Ruth.
one more thing, Phil. I you know, to Mark's point that there are certain school districts, some in the Northeast Kingdom, but I'm sure there are other places in the state that have severe health and safety issues with their facilities, and we're in a global pandemic. So I guess, you know, to Representative Webb's point, if there's some way we could pivot this to get it going faster to meet the needs, I'm thinking like air handling systems are probably going to need to be upgraded for health and safety reasons, and other things, cafeterias maybe. I would really like to get this moving faster for that purpose, and then maybe hold off on the, you know, oh, we need to put in a new football field. So that would be my preference if we get this bill, that's how we look at it.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and I just want to add with that point that if let's say the CARES Act funding, if the idea is to use that for those purposes, some of the guidance that I've heard on this issue in terms of bricks and mortar is that it's more an issue of immediacy. So the funds have to be expended by the end of the year. So it's a little bit harder with like construction projects. So if, let's say, a heating and cooling system did fall under what an eligible use was under the CARES Act funding sort of criteria, I think the tricky part would be making sure that the money, that the school expends the money to get that project sort of completed by December 30th.
I wonder, does the project have to be completed, or do you just have to outlay the money?
So yeah, so I guess you could technically maybe pay the contractor.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. If a district got an estimate and paid up front, and then the work was completed next year, I mean, works for me.
Yeah, I had a meeting with Steve Klein this morning on that. Now, his reading on this is that the work actually has to be completed by December 31st,
Okay.
which is a problem. I mean, it's a problem for a lot of things besides this.
Well, and everybody knows we're through our federal delegation, we're trying to get more flexibility in the CARES Act. So maybe that will come through not only in this way, but filling the hole in the ed fund too. So I believe we're going to lose Becky in 5 minutes. She has another commitment at 3. Any final questions for Becky on the language itself? Okay, well, not seeing any. Becky, thank you so much. That was incredibly enlightening. Answered a lot of my questions about the moratorium, which has been a little bit mysterious. So just my final question is, so there was language recently in the Capitol Bill 2018 extending the intent of the legislature to have a moratorium, but language could go into the Capitol Bill this year, for instance, stating our intention no longer to have that. That's the place where the lifting of the moratorium, so to speak, would logically happen.
Yes. So I believe the last time it was extended was 2016.
2016.
But it has traditionally been session law in the Capitol Bill that has sort of spoken to that intent.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We may invite you back as we traipse through this,
Sure.
but thank you very much. Mark, also thank you. We'll probably have committee discussion now, so feel free to stay if you like, but feel free to leave also. I know you have other stuff.
I have another meeting, so I'm going to go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Yep.
Okay, committee. So to return to where we started, we're in a kind of an odd environment where I spoke with Senator Ash about how he imagines the process working from here on in. It has been exclusively featuring bills that had universal unanimity. So it had to be unanimous pretty much in the Senate, unanimous agreement with the House so that we could pass and concur on every bill. We've exited that now, and Senator Ash does believe that we should be moving bills that we may not have complete agreement with the House on. So that would entail perhaps virtual conferences on down the road. I still want to make sure that if we're moving a bill, it's not something that the House is opposed to or that they don't have any intention of working on. So what I'm going to ask Representative Webb for is, what is her estimation of the chances that her committee will go along with our 2 priority bills? And I will offer the same kind of general assessment back to her. So my question for you now is, what's your general sense of whether you could support a version of this bill, maybe not as expensive, maybe spending the money differently, but aiming at because this is clearly aimed at lifting the moratorium in one way or another. So thoughts on your general enthusiasm or support for the thrust of the bill. Debbie.
Well, I really think that if we pass something that pays $1.5 million to a consultant in the middle of all this, and we're having, we're concerned about where, our revenue has gone down so much and how we're going to do it. And even if the federal government, I have very little enthusiasm, let me put it that way.
Okay. How about if we bracket that, how about for the other parts of the bill which are looking at, it seems to me it's focused on bringing the standards up and then putting in place some kind of regime where the state would go back to funding portions of projects based on priorities set in the legislature.
Yeah, yes, I could support that.
Okay, so a yes on that, and then a blinking question mark on the appropriation. Other thoughts?
Conceptually, I support it.
Oh, let me go with Andy and then to you, Corey. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I'm supportive of trying to get the funding to the schools. They definitely need it. I have no doubt in the need of the deplorable condition of a lot of our schools. So I'm interested in the bill in that regard. I'm a little worried about spending the money on doing the evaluation without having a plan of how we're going to come up with the money. So we'll come out with another report that says, oh no, the schools need money, which we know, and then we'll still be in a loggerheads about how to pay for it. And then 5 years will go by down and we'll want to hire another consultant to see where we are. So I'd rather us figure out how we're going to fund it, knowing that it's a big number. I don't know if it matters if it's 300 million or 500 million.
Yeah,
So.
I remember when I was on the Burlington School Board, I left the board, and the next year they decided to do a system-wide look at deferred maintenance. In other words, what would the entire price tag be? And it produced a cost that was so eye-popping that voters revolted, and they basically buried the report never to be seen again. And they spent the money producing the report and didn't spend it on the actual repairs, instead of saying, okay, what, according to these priorities, what should be done in the next 5 years or the next 6 years? So Corey, you had some thoughts.
I just said conceptually, I'm supportive of the idea of us taking a look at how we could fund these projects, but I don't have a stance necessarily on, like, when we get to discussion how we're going to fund them.
Yeah. I mean, the days when we could just magically say the ed fund are really gone for now. We're going to be lucky if we aren't raising taxes to an insane degree this coming year. That again goes back to whether the federal government allows us to backfill what we've lost in terms of sales tax and other things. Jim.
Yes, I've seen plenty of pictures from all these different school districts of children sitting in classrooms with the roof leaking around them. Kids in trailers, that chicken coops are built better than some of the classrooms that I've seen. I don't think it would take an engineer and us spend $1.5 million when we already know a good number of these schools buildings that should be targeted immediately for $1.5 million. I would rather see that money spent that way, getting some of these places health and safety, or they should be closed down. But there's not the nerve of the health department to close down some of these school buildings or cafeterias or bathroom facilities. I'm thinking of one specifically that should have been closed down years ago. I was just thinking that money would be better spent renovating or rebuilding some of these classrooms or wings to a building than it is to spend money on, just for another report with graphs and pictures on it. I think I've seen plenty of that.
Yeah. And I mean, it can help sometimes to build our knowledge base and then appropriate from that and have a phased thing. It can help politically to build the will for something like lifting the moratorium. I guess I see it, this moment, the COVID emergency moment, as a moment where we should be able to agree on things like this. We're looking newly at our schools and the learning process and what needs to be there, what needs to be in place, health and safety and public health, number one. And then beyond that, how does remote learning go forward if you don't have broadband and other things? So it might not be a bad idea to see if we can't think about some kind of the bullet points that Becky showed us about the priorities were emergency first, health and safety second, and then a series of bulleted priorities after that. If we came forward to lift the moratorium with an updated version of that, maybe it's a moment to do that without the $1.5 million consultant report under our arm. So we're clearly going to need more testimony on this. And let me know if I misstate this. I would say it's the committee's initial read that we're interested in, seeing, can we move past the moratorium in one way or another, get help to districts. We are skeptical openly about the $1.5 million for the consultant, but not skeptical of the idea of moving money directly to districts in emergency need, presupposing that we can come up with uniform standards, engineering facilities. And in that way, the first part of this bill is, seems to me, has our support so far. Debbie.
I kind of wanted to hear from Senator Hardy. I don't think she had a chance to weigh in.
Oh, go ahead, Ruth.
Thanks, Debbie. I mean, I agree that spending money on a consultant right now is pretty much the last thing we would want to do. I think we can come up with our own priority list based on the COVID emergency and what we've seen schools needing to do. I would be in favor of getting money out to schools, but I'm also skeptical that we have much money to get out to schools. And then one thing I didn't ask Mark, but it didn't look like in the bill there was any money for AOE for staff support for this, for facilities. And I think that that's been one of the big barriers at the state level, is just not having somebody at the education agency to support schools through this work. So to the extent that we're able to throw them something, it would be helpful for this to be successful in the longer run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, workload is definitely a key going forward. So if you, I mean, the consultant in part is meant to take the load off the agency, but at that inflated price tag, not inflated like the House inflated it, but inflated over what we're currently spending on consultant, which is nothing. So, okay, all good points. I will communicate with Representative Webb that we're interested in the bill. We're going to be working on it more, but we do have significant questions. So, we'll see what they have to say about our two priority bills. They may feel similarly. Difference being that what they've given us doesn't represent a hard-fought compromise between opposed parties. Both of our bills do. So if you change either of our bills significantly, there's a tenuous balance that's going to be upset. She's probably not going to be as sympathetic to that as I would like, but so for Thursday, we'll hopefully have a couple of more witnesses on this topic. And also Ruth and I got an email from Senator Clarkson with some questions about adult education. They apparently, under guidance by AOE, they've been tasked with providing in-person standardized testing for their adult learning students by June 1st. And they rightly say that no one else is being required to do standardized testing. So I will hear back from them later today, hopefully. We'll see if we can take up that topic as well. Just one update on a topic we had going. The constituent of Debbie's and mine that touched off our discussion on the amount being paid for childcare, the 100% that they were being asked to pay. The Edge, which runs their childcare, has emailed them new guidance clarifying that they only need to pay 50% and has offered them a credit toward the amount they paid. So that was a happy ending. Good work on our part. We got clarification out to other childcare providers, and we got partial recompense for some of those parents. So any last thoughts, Ruth?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of to that point, give a little update if it's okay on the transition committee. And the
Absolutely.
work we've been doing. Okay. So Anthony, Senator Polina and I were assigned to education issues for this transition period. And at this point, the committee is putting together, sort of honing down the lists. We got lists from all the chairs via, all the committees via the chairs. And then we all brainstorm lists. And so there are lists and lists and lists out there. So we're trying to hone down the lists. I did have a really good conversation with Sarah Kenny from Let's Grow Kids this afternoon to just sort of get their perspective on the childcare thing. So that, as you know, childcare programs are allowed to open as of June 1st, but they don't have complete guidance on what they're supposed to do yet. And it's May, whatever, 12th. So there's a lot of anxiety out there about how things will work and the financing and the logistics. Summer camps also will be opening, and the guidance for summer camps and childcare programs, it sounds like, are going to dovetail. So that's all in the works, hopefully over the next couple weeks, but it's going to be kind of a scramble to get that working. And as Sarah and I were talking about, it's kind of a preview for what's going to happen in the fall with schools and colleges. So for better or worse, these early childhood programs are kind of the guinea pigs for the state for opening up programs with kids. So anyway, we're meeting again tomorrow, the transitions committee at some point. So I can continue to keep you updated on what all that is going to.
Okay, great. And then I spoke with Tim about that yesterday, I think. His idea is that when you've finished, the constituent pieces of your report go back out to the committees of jurisdiction, and then we can take up what you've finally come up with. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. So on Thursday, we'll be meeting at 2:30, not 2. That was a special change today to accommodate Becky. So 2:30 to 4 on Thursday. And have a great afternoon. It looks beautiful out.
Thank you. You too.
Don't go into any banks.